So shall we go ahead and get started, Sue?
Yes, please, let's do. I gave you an introduction and you didn't get to hear it.
Okay, terrific. Maybe it's best that way. I do want to provide a little context because wisdom is not an area that is typically associated with workplace and performance improvement. I got into this area of interest a few years ago after I started studying organizational sustainability issues, trying to find a way to balance the way organizations look at outcomes, not just looking at financial outcomes, but also looking at societal and environmental outcomes and balancing those with the financial. And I was getting increasingly frustrated that the solution seemed pretty straightforward and still to me seem technologically straightforward even today. But what I noticed is that we don't seem to be choosing sustainable solutions for some reason. And that took me down the road to start looking at wisdom. And I started looking into the sort of the neuroscience aspect of wisdom as opposed to the philosophical side of wisdom. So that's how we ended up here today. So that's when that's the background of how wisdom at least has become important for me. So what I'm really hoping to cover today are three things. Asking whether wisdom is relevant to workplace. What is wisdom, in fact? And then can we intentionally develop it? And if so, how? Those are the three things I'd really like to cover. So wisdom in the workplace. Why do we need it? Well, I think if we look around, we can see that all sorts of evidence that we've got lots of intelligence and intellect being applied in the workplace. But if you look at only the application of intelligence and don't look at the wise application of intelligence, you end up with a lot of things like greed, short-term thinking that's focused on process, Band-Aid solutions that may work for a little while but may have unintended consequences that have negative impact down the road. Looking at things that are real value, not just money. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see Jeff Skilling. Of course, the Enron is now a few years behind us, thank goodness. But those were some pretty smart guys at Enron. Intellect was not, or lack of intellect was certainly not a problem. It was the lack of good judgment and, I would argue, wisdom that led to a lot of the problems in that situation. So let's. One of the things I guess I'd like to talk about early on in the process is the difference between intellect and wisdom. This is a definition that was originally proposed by Vivian Clayton, one of the first researchers, at least in this country, to study wisdom, specifically wisdom. Intellect, she says, is the ability to think logically and to conceptualize and to go from abstract to reality. And if you think about that, if you think about the things that we tend to study in school that are intellectual pursuits, you'll see that they're often connected to a specific domain. They tend to be impersonal and non-social, unless, of course, the intellectual area is about studying something social like sociology. But if you study computer science, you're developing intellect in a very specific field. It doesn't necessarily cross domains. Typically, when you think about intellect, it focuses on how to do something. Wisdom, on the other hand, really extends knowledge to the understanding of human nature, to the understanding of yourself. I'm going to allow another viewer, and is based on principles that often contradict one another, that often offer paradoxes, and we can maybe talk about this as we go along. Wisdom tends to deal with things that are social, that are deeply personal, that aren't necessarily based on analytical rules. And they tend to focus on questions of should we do something, not how do we do something. What I'd like to throw out to the group is a question of how we might define these. If we were to complete the sentence, a wise person is someone who, what does a wise person look like? Have we got some suggestions from the group that's online?
This is Craig. I would say I've always heard the adage, a wise person is someone who thinks before they act.
They think before they act. Great. Sure. What else? Feel free to speak up or enter your comments in chat. Big picture. Great.
Selena?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a person who is wise is thoughtful.
Thoughtful. Terrific. Anything else?
A person who's wise thinks before they speak.
Thinks before they speak. Terrific. So let's look at some of the characteristics then. Those are all right on target. So if we were to look at the quality of wise people, the research that's been done shows us that wise people tend to be people who learn from experience, especially negative experience. You learn from our mistakes. They tend to demonstrate an ability to step outside themselves and assess a troubling situation calmly, to disassociate from the emotional response and look at something objectively. They tend to be people who can recast crises as problems to be solved. In other words, to avoid that panic instinct and look at it calmly as a problem or a situation that can be addressed analytically. They tend to be people who take action when they can and acknowledge when matters are outside their control. In other words, they're able to set boundaries and work on those things over which they can have control and let those things go where they don't have a lot of influence. And finally, I don't know, this may mean that I have no hope of being wise. They're almost embarrassingly positive. They tend to have a very positive outlook on life. So we'll talk about some of these. So a few general principles of wisdom. Rely on experience-based knowledge of the world as opposed to necessarily an abstract knowledge of the world or the things that you've experienced. Engage in mental focus, know when to follow rules and when the rules don't apply, know when to set the rules aside. Mediate and balance the conflicting interests of emotion and reason, find a happy balance there. Know right from wrong both individually and socially. Commit to the welfare of self and others, and defer immediate gratification for longer-term gain. Now, a lot of this presentation is based on a book that Stephen Hall wrote on wisdom. So if you decide at some point that you want to look into these, some of these concepts a little bit more deeply, I recommend you take a look at that. But Hall covers 8, what he calls the neural pillars of wisdom, and we'll cover all 8 today. The first is emotional regulation. That's the art of coping. How do we take control of our emotions so that, as some of you suggested, you think before you act. Instead of emotions driving action, you can interrupt the process, that step where you might have been in a situation before where you had an emotion and you had a knee-jerk reaction based on that emotion. You can interrupt that process and insert some cognitive control over it. The second is knowing what's important, establishing value, intentionally establishing value. Third is moral reasoning, judging right from wrong. Fourth would be the exercise of compassion, having empathy for others. The fifth is humility, understanding perspective, understanding the emotions and motivations of other people. Sixth is altruism, which really consists of fairness, social justice, and punishment. The seventh is patience, delaying gratification. I think we've all had experience with this. And finally, the eighth is dealing with uncertainty, knowing how to solve problems. These are the 8 areas in which people have done research that looks into the components of wisdom. So let's talk about emotional regulation first. Emotional regulation, if we break it down, really has to do with self-awareness and balance and resilience. And really, I think that emotional regulation and this maybe came up in your definitions when you were tossing them out earlier, is the heart of wisdom. Being able to step outside oneself and interrupt an emotional response and come up with a calm, considered response. If you look at all of the components of wisdom, at least for me, the heart of it starts with emotional regulation. And we can talk a little bit about that here. It tends to be, emotional regulation really tends to be a careful balance of passion, which we still all need, and detachment in the face of a challenge. And, interestingly enough, older people, we tend to associate wisdom with people who are older. Older people seem to have it figured out, and the research supports that. We can talk about that. In fact, if you look at the article that I published in Performance Improvement Journal, outlined some research that was done at Stanford, where they gave a number of people beepers, and they would beep, they'd send them a message that would cause the beeper to go off up to 5 times a day, and no matter what they were doing, they agreed to sit down, stop what they were doing, and record how they were feeling and what activities they were engaged in order to see how often they were in a state that could be called happy. In addition, the study also did MRI, functional MRI. They did interviews. So it was actually pretty comprehensive, and it was done over a fairly long period. And what they discovered was that the older you were, the happier you tended to be. So, and the question is, why is that so? Well, it's actually pretty interesting that if you look at this timeline here, if in the left-hand being, we can call that birth, or we can, if you like, the beginning of consciousness, and see that horizontal line as one's lifetime, then younger people are not as far along that particular line. They have less context for highs and lows, and they also have an open-ended sense of the future. They really, because they haven't lived as much a life, their focus is on gaining knowledge. If you look at people who are older and farther along, farther to the right on that timeline, now they have a greater context for highs and lows. And what we found is that the research has found that they have a sense of mortality. They have a sense of the end of their lives, as opposed to just this open-ended sense of life going on forever. And as a result, they tend to focus on emotional richness and relationships. So if you look at the events in our lives as we go along the continuum, you can see that our lives are all filled with sort of highs and lows. You might have really great positive experience. Maybe you go to the prom, or maybe the prom is a really bad experience. It seems to be polarizing. Or you might get a new car, and that's considered a really a high point. Or you might have a relationship breakup as a really low point. But when you're young, all of these highs and lows tend to seem to be really high peaks and really low valleys. When you get older, and I guess you can see that picture illustrates that what you're seeing is an event from a really close perspective, as opposed to what you're seeing is the tree, and from a really close perspective of the tree. As you get older, what we see is that same sets of highs and lows in the events is really offset by time. You can see that, those may seem high and low, but compared to all of the things that have happened over my life, they're really not that momentous. In other words, we gain a sense of perspective. And what the researchers also found is that it doesn't necessarily take age to make this happen. Any really strong and sometimes catastrophic event that upset people's lives could also put lives into some sort of different perspective and give them that long-term view. So in youth, all trees tend to look huge. All events tend to take on greater meaning. can we counter that? No, we probably can't. But what we can do is remind people that the highs and lows tend to be emotional highs and lows. And as we move on, those emotions do change over time. So if we look specifically at emotional regulation, what are some of the things that you can do in order to gain emotional regulation? Well, the research is actually pretty consistent. They say that adults who practice meditation, and not just adults, this has been done with children as well, tend to have a strategy for overcoming impulse and making better choices. And I think it's probably important to point out here that when we're talking about meditation, we're not talking about a religious practice. We're talking about contemplative practice, self-reflection. And so if it makes it easier for you to think about meditation in terms of contemplation or reflection, I would encourage you to do that. In point of fact, all religions, organized religions, have had some sort of contemplative practice at some point and in some way. But the contemplative practice isn't necessarily connected with any religion. It just seems to be part of thinking about things and putting things in perspective. So that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a specific religious application here. What we're talking about is the ability to step back and review how things happen, why they happen, and our role in them. Let's move on. The second sort of neural pillar of wisdom is knowing what's important. The decision making is this invisible process of weighing the relative value of different courses of action and then making a decision. Here, this is Paul Glimcher. He's a professor of neuroscience and economics and psychology at New York University. He did some really interesting research that studies the neural circuitry of how we weigh information and evaluate choices and then deliberate before making a decision. So the research that he did was interesting in that he would put people in a situation. He said, listen, I'll offer you $20 now, or I'll offer you $40 in 2 months. Well, let me ask you, what do you think most people chose? Any idea? Thoughts?
$20 now.
$20 now. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd say $20.
And I would say it depends on the age of the responder.
Good. In point of fact, in his study, he found that almost everybody chose the $20. The question is, why do people choose $20? $40 in 2 months. 2 months isn't that long, so it's in the economic best interests to take double the money in 2 months. Why do you suppose people took the $20 instead of the $40?
Could some of it be a trust thing as well?
I'm sorry, what was that, Craig? Go ahead with that.
I was wondering, obviously, it's $20 now in my hand and I have a need right now, so I think that's part of it. But I wonder if also there's some cynicism involved, where, you showed me that $20 right now. It's tangible. I don't know that I believe you that I'll get the $40.
Sure. I don't know the specifics of the study, but I suspect that they probably accounted for that. What was the other comment that we had there that I didn't hear?
It's Selena. I was saying that it's short-term gratification. We are not necessarily a society that says, wait, think forward. We do things in the moment. Right.
Very good. And actually, to a certain extent, both of those answers are on target. What's happening is actually something that's going on in the brain. The immediate gratification gives you a spritz of a chemical called dopamine. It's sort of like the happy chemical. It creates pleasure. It's when you're feeling a sense of pleasure, it's typically a spritz of the chemical dopamine in your brain. That's not necessarily accompanied with longer-term goals. So we've evolved as creatures. We've evolved, and the dopamine spritz is still associated with things that tend to be short-term. So when in our decision-making process, there tends to be two stages here. One is to set a value on the option. And what Glimcher's work has shown us is that the first stage is really subjective. It can really vary from person to person, and it often is deeply flawed, at least from an economic viewpoint. But this still seems to be the way we make a lot of our decisions. The second stage is then to choose the best option. But because we're setting the value first and the value is subjective, what happens when we select the best option, we're selecting one that was guided by emotion and not necessarily by an analytical choice. This is Barry Schwartz, and he wrote a really fascinating book called The Paradox of Choice. And when he looked at the way people make decisions, he did things like looking at the number of choices we have. Well, we've been told and convinced by marketing professionals who do a great job in this country and in other countries as well, of convincing us that what we want is more choice and more choice and more choice. Well, Barry's work started to look at that, and he said, what I'm saying is that up to a certain point we like choice, but after a certain point, choices become they have this diminishing return. He would go into supermarkets and say, well, how many choices are there for salad dressing? And you've got 150 choices. Well, now all of a sudden, making a choice becomes a problem. It doesn't free us. It actually starts to pile on cognitive load. And if you think about the number of times you have to make seemingly insignificant choices that still add to cognitive load during our modern, our society with our modern day choosing having the lights on, having the lights off, choosing what to buy, what not to buy, which roads to take on the way to work, the cognitive load piles up pretty quickly. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend that the book. Small markets over big grocery stores. Yeah, terrific. That's a great way to start to reduce the number of choices. So here's the question that Glimcher really came back to. Impatience for physiological needs, foods and liquids, meeting those biological needs was pretty high on the survival list. And that's why the brain circuitry is really wired to give you that dopamine spritz to keep you doing it. The question is there any feedback loop for wise decisions, for wise behavior? Did Gandhi get a spritz of dopamine when he committed a selfless act? Can we interrupt our emotional responses in ways that allow us to place greater value on things that are wiser, as opposed to immediately gratifying? So what does all this mean? What it means is that a lot of our decision-making processes, despite what we may think, and despite what, especially if we've been going to school for a while, we may think that our decisions are being made in the prefrontal cortex with intent, but a lot of it is happening unconsciously. We're having a lot of influence from the emotional and older sides of our brains. When we're faced with a decision with a large number of uncertainties, we'll come back to this a little bit later, intuition may be better than reflection. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Possible implications. Our decisions really rely on good input, narrowing down one's choices. And narrowing down one's choices seems to really rely on focused attention. And instead of letting the mind wander, focusing on the parts and pieces that are there. So studies, again, have shown again and again that meditation can provide, or let's say contemplation can provide useful training for becoming more detached, less emotionally responsive, and less effortful in maintaining attention. Third part, more reasoning. This is the third component of wisdom, determining right from wrong. And the question is this conscious? Do we have control over deciding what is right or wrong, or is this a biologically driven decision-making process as well? And the reason I have this trolley here, some of you I'm sure are familiar with I'm going to go back here, the study that asks you to make a decision. In fact, I'll go forward and we'll talk about this. Some of the research that's been done suggests that even judgments about right or wrong may be part of our brains, and we'll talk about this. An emotional or gut response to something, particularly things like disgust, influence the way we make moral choices. And you would think that moral choices are sort of the heart of our analytical brains, being able to make decisions between right and wrong. Some of the research that was done here is also pretty interesting. They put people in a room and gave them an ethical dilemma, such as lying or cheating on an exam. Well, some of the subjects were put into clean, sterile environments, and other subjects were put into rooms that were dirty, might have had trash and smelling trash in the garbage next to them, dirty desks in front of them. What impact do you think, if any, that might have had on the moral judgments that they were asked to make in the tests? Any ideas? Sped up decision. That's a good thought. Anything else? View of the moral choices that were involved. In other words, they would tend to be more critical of the student who was cheating on an exam. What this suggests is that the emotions do impact moral choice. So, for instance, if we look at, go back to that trolley example, if one of the things that they have studied is an ethical dilemma where you've got a trolley, sort of a runaway trolley coming down a hill, and you've got a split in the track on one side of the track where the trolley is already headed. You've got a group of people waiting around. They can't move. So you've got several people on one side. On the other split, the other set of rails, you have a single person. And so the analytical choice, the moral choice here is: you are in the position where you can send the trolley down the track with a single person, or you can let it continue down the track with several people. Well, most people would choose, in the studies, chose, all right, I'm going to flip the switch, I'll send it down. It's the lesser of these two outcomes. Both are horrific, but it's less horrific to kill one person than it is to kill multiple people. So if they had the choice, they would flip the switch, send the trolley down a different set of rails, and that's how they would deal with the problem. However, if you change the scenario a little bit and say you're standing on a bridge over these trolley tracks, and the only way to keep the trolley from crashing into this group of people is to push one person off the track, and then that will derail the trolley and save the people on the track. But you have to push this person against their will in front of the trolley. People had a great deal of trouble with that, and again, it's because our brains see the actual pushing of a person in a very different light than pulling a switch. We're hardwired to see the harm, the deliberate harm of somebody with whom we have physical contact as a much different task than flipping a switch. Again, what this is leading back to is there's a lot of neural circuitry involved in some of the decisions that we think are more under our control. The fourth element of wisdom is compassion, having empathy for others, expressing loving kindness toward other people. The golden, the expression of the golden rule: never do to others what you would not like them to do to you. This is again supported by some great research. This is Richard Davidson. He's a professor of psychology and psychiatry. He's the director of the Waisman Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior at the University of Wisconsin. He's done a lot of work with Matthew Ricard, who has a PhD in molecular biology. Interestingly enough, Ricard, the day that he received his PhD, he sort of left the world of academia behind and became a Buddhist monk. He's now been a monk for many, many years. He's got over 10,000 hours of meditation practice. But what Richard Davidson wanted to study was when this very practiced monk was doing meditation on compassion, what did it look like in the brain? Well, it actually changed the circuitry of the brain. When Ricard would put himself into a deep meditative state, focusing on compassion, you could actually see that in the EKGs and the MRIs that were done. Here you can see Ricard with all the test equipment hooked up to his face. This seems to be based on something many of you may have heard on as mirror neurons. These are neurons that allow us to sense another creature's intentions and also feel another creature's physical experience vicariously. So if you're watching a movie at home and you see somebody get hurt, sometimes you'll wince because you were vicariously experiencing the pain that somebody else that you've visually seen is experiencing in front of you. And that is the activation of those mirror neurons. You're sympathizing, you're empathizing with the experience that somebody else is feeling. And that, again, that's hardwired into the brain. So compassion is something that seems to be, at least to a certain extent, part of our neural circuitry. Can we become more compassionate? Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The studies have suggested that the mind can be trained to enhance compassion and emotional regulation. How? Again, it's this contemplative self-reflective process. And it doesn't take the 10,000 hours that Ricard had put in order to start looking at this. Just 20 days of training for 20 minutes a day can start to actually rewire the neural circuitry in your brain in ways that have an outward impact. The fifth neural pillar of wisdom is humility, perspective. And this really begins with self-awareness, especially of one's own limitations. You can see the quote here: humility does not mean you think less of yourself. It means you think of yourself less. I love that quote. We're starting to run low on time here, and I want to allow some questions, so I'm going to skip over this. The study they did on this was done at Penn State University, and the way they measured it was not by looking at humility, but by looking at its opposite. They started looking at corporate CEOs, and they measured not humility, but narcissism by looking at the size of the photos, the length of the entries in Who's Who, the CEO's name, how often the CEO's name appeared in press releases, how often the CEO would use the term I as opposed to we. And what they found is non-humble CEOs changed strategy frequently and had less predictable performance. What that means is they would often have stunning successes, but they would also have stunning crashes as well. So to the extent that a CEO was less humble meant that they had wider swings in their performance. Traits associated with humility tended to be people who are humble tend to acknowledge limitations and mistakes. They tend to be open to new ideas and contradictory knowledge. They avoid self-aggrandizement. They share credit. They keep their own perspectives in their own achievements in perspective, and they know their own strengths and weaknesses. What we found is that they share credit with others, and when the group makes mistakes, they tend to be the ones that take responsibility for mistakes while sharing credit with other people. This is really interesting. I'll just quickly pass over this. If you look at the Gettysburg Address, Edward Everett, the speaker who came before Lincoln, spoke for 2 hours. When Lincoln got up, of course, when you think about the Gettysburg Address, it took 3 minutes. It was 272 words long. Everett later wrote to Lincoln and suggested that he might have done an okay job, and Lincoln wrote back. He said, "I'm pleased to know that, in your judgment, the little I did say was not entirely a failure." I love that. And an expression of humility in the face of maybe bombast. The sixth component of wisdom is altruism or cooperation. You look at these people, they tend to be people who have put cooperation above self-interest. Looks at things such as fairness, social justice, selfless devotion to a greater good. The research that's done on this, it used to be, and not so long ago, that we thought that everyone was out for themselves, and the basis for most decisions was made on the basis of what do I get out of this? What's in it for me? But if you look at some of the work of Ernest Fair at Zurich University, he's really sort of overturned this and said that, that there's a survival component to cooperation. That people who cooperated tend to have a greater chance of survival as opposed to those who only looked out for themselves. And he has used game theory, and I'm not, in order to leave some time for questions at the end, I won't go into it, but it really did look at the ways that we use issues of fairness to punish people who tend not to be fair, and to reward people who contribute to the common good, who contribute to the group outcome. We can come back to this if people have questions about it. And finally, not finally, the second to last, the seventh is patience. I think we've all experienced this. This is dealing with temptation, finding ways to delay gratification, learning to wait for larger rewards. And the question really is, why do we knowingly choose things that we will regret later, that we know we're going to regret later? This is a great cartoon. What happens when you see a button that says "Do not push"? What's the natural inclination? The natural inclination is, well, let's see what happens when we push it. There's a reason for this. Again, research has been done. The guy's name at Harvard, I think it was Harvard. It was either Harvard or MIT. I'd have to look it up right now. Came up with something called the hyperbolic curve, or the temporal discounting. What happens is, the closer we get to something, the more importance it takes to us, the more importance our brains, our emotions assign to it. So if you look at this picture on the top, you'll see a tire. Well, the tire, because it's very close to us physically, appears larger than the car that's in the background. This happens to us temporally as well. As something is closer to us in time, we tend to assign greater importance to it, greater significance to it. So if you were to say, I've got a reward for you today, or a reward for you tomorrow, well, the reward today is far more important than tomorrow. But if you look at the reward a year from now, or a year and a day from now, those are largely the same, because they're really far off. So the closer something is, the greater the importance it is. And it's really difficult for us to take long-term benefits into consideration. For many of us, that takes the shape of, you know what, it's just chips now. I can work them off at the gym over the next week. Of course, tomorrow you have the same chips in front of you, or you've got a hot dog, or you've got your exercise, balanced against your exercise regimen. It's really difficult to make those long-term choices unless you've got a habit of doing so. And finally, the last pillar of wisdom has to do with dealing with uncertainty. How do we deal with things that come up that are unexpected? Do we deal with them in a knee-jerk reaction, or do we think through them analytically? And can we choose the right approach to deal with it? Do we know when to break the rules? So there really tend to be two approaches to decision making. The first is based on models, and models are based on experience. In other words, we've done something a number of times. For instance, if you drive to work, you typically drive to work the same way all the time. What happens after a while? You start doing an autopilot. You've got a model for how you get to work. Your brain doesn't really need to devote nearly as much attention to it. And so you make decisions based on how you've always gotten to work. And you can see that this is really driven by intuition or emotion. You're just basing your decision-making processes for these model-based decisions based on what's happened in the past and your emotional responses. However, what happens when you The road is on the way to work is closed. You've got a detour sign. Now all of a sudden you don't have a model that deals with it. You don't have prior experience that deals with it. You rely on problem solving and analysis, which takes a lot longer. You have to apply cognitive thought. You have to go through a routine to figure out how you're going to deal with the problem. And this involves the newer, prefrontal cortex problem solving part of the brain. And wisdom comes in knowing which one to apply. Do we use our emotive responses that are based on past experience, or do we use our newer cognitive approaches to deal with the problem in front of us? Now, most of the problems that we're faced with don't have detour signs. They're really fuzzy, and we don't have a clear indication of when our models don't apply and when they do apply. So knowing when to apply isn't necessarily as easy as reading a detour sign. It's knowing when the detour sign isn't there and we still need to take a different route. The research suggests something pretty interesting, and it seems to defy conventional wisdom. When the problem's simple, when it doesn't have that many variables, that's the time when we should be using analytical thinking. When we have a problem with a great many variables, typically what we need to do is use our analytical brains to gather the data and then let the guys in the basement, the gals in the basement, work on it in our subconscious and make an intuitive decision. It's counterintuitive. You think that when there's a really difficult problem, a complex task in front of us, we really want to bring all of our analytical powers to bear. But what happens is our analytical brains really aren't able to, in most cases, deal with a number of variables and make sense of them. We can only deal with a lower number of variables analytically. And then when we reach a certain threshold, we're much better off letting our emotional side, our deeper brain, make some of those, make greater sense of all those variables after we've analyzed them cognitively. So we can gather the data, we can look at the data, but when it's actually time to make a decision, some of the older, more emotive, intuitive parts of the brain seem to be better at making those judgments. What are some of the conclusions? The world's fast. It's pushing us along. It's requiring us to make more and more decisions. It's pushing us to make those decisions analytically. That's a great question, Sue. 1 second. And it's challenging us to improve performance and competitiveness in this fast-changing environment. We don't have a lot of detour signs to tell us when we shouldn't be using one process over another. Sue, can you remind me of your question? Go ahead and speak up if you would.
Yeah, I just want to know how you would think a CEO would react to using his intuition with a complex problem.
That's a really good question. I think it depends on the CEO and what their experience is and what the decision is. I think if the data is still gathered analytically, it's gathered systematically and systemically, as we tend to do our data gathering in this field, then allowing the CEO to make a gut level decision after the analytical presentation of the data, I think a lot of them may feel pretty comfortable with that. It depends on what their decision-making preferences are. But you're right, it's a question.
Yeah.
There's been applications recently of lower and more level people.
I can barely hear you. Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. This is Margot. There have been publications recently citing the fact that CEOs are starting to choose people now based on their emotional intelligence rather than just IQ. So the research that my colleagues are doing, the signal work and emotional intelligence, is indicating exactly what you're saying. And to put it in really simple terms, yes, you use all of the analytical skills and then you sleep on it meaning letting your creative subconscious deal with it, and you wake up with the path that you choose.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and a lot of this work has been built upon by Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize. He's a behavioral economist, which is, I think, an interesting field to combine behavior studies in behavior and looking at how decisions are made. And he outlined that in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and or was it Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast? I'd have to look. In any case, terrific book on how we make decisions. Thank you, Margot. That's great contribution. Are most EI assessments a reliable indicator? The chat window disappeared before I read the last of that. Can you repeat the last of that?
Are you asking about Linda's question, Tony?
Yeah, there we go. A reliable indicator for wisdom. Oh gosh. I don't know. What I do know, at least the conclusion that I've come to after reading through study after study and reading through Hall's book and the research at least I've had available, is that the world seems to be going faster. Intellectually, we've got the tools to create a very fast world. But wisdom seems to be built around contemplation and self-awareness and slowing things down. So it's not that we can't slow things down now, but we have to find mechanisms and strategies for slowing things down so that we're not making decisions based on, I would say, false input from the emotional sides of our brains that are emotional reactions to something as opposed to deliberate decisions about something.
And one more addition, Tony, Dr. Darwin Nelson continuously reminds us that human beings are the only living creatures capable of reflecting.
Yes.
So that's encouraging.
Yeah. We've got the tools to do it, but it's hard to. Society isn't constructed in a way to make it easy for us right now.
We have a question in the chat area that's asking if anyone on the call has seen meditation successfully brought into the workplace, or should the practice stay an individual or personal activity?
Since that was directed to the group, I'll let members of the group see if they have an answer for that.
This is Mary Ellen at Casotakis, and I understand, but have not been. Can't confirm this, but I understand that at Google and at Facebook they have implemented programs on mindfulness, so that people can create space in the day.
Sure.
That works.
Yeah, reflection can take place anywhere. It doesn't need to be for a certain amount of time. It could be for 2 minutes. It could be for 20 minutes. It could be for 2 hours. But often it just means slowing down and paying attention, as opposed to letting the mind, which, if you think about how thoughts tend to have a will of their own, and they'll go off. First, they'll be thinking about the past. Then they'll be thinking with anxiety about the future. We tend to have a great deal of trouble staying in the present moment. It's sort of like riding a wild elephant through the brush. We often feel like we have very little control over our thoughts. Self-reflective moments are when we get a chance to watch that process, so that when emotional content comes up, we don't feel like we have to ride the elephant into the thicket. We have a little bit of a chance to steer things in one direction or another that is of our choosing.
Tony, I have a question.
Please.
It seems as though this new suggested behavior is everything antithetical to how organizations reward staff for their performance. What kind of impact do you think this has on organizational culture?
I think I'm going to give you my gut reaction to that. because I don't have specific data. But I will say that my reaction to that is that it's hurting performance and in a big way. If you look at what Peter Senge said, we tend to focus on outcomes.
Yes.
And we tend to focus on a single outcome, and that is financial outcomes. And we make that our goal, and we really target that goal. But he goes on to say that that's really ridiculous. He said, if we're focusing on process and focusing on what we're doing, the outcomes should take care of themselves. In other words, instead of having a single-minded focus on the outcome, if we'll look up occasionally and make sure we're still aligned with the outcomes we want, and then mindfully pay attention to the process, those outcomes will take far less effort and should take care of themselves. So the financial rewards should take care of themselves. The other rewards, the ecological, the sociological rewards should take care of themselves. It's when we become focused on the reward and ignore the process that we tend to run into trouble. We waste a lot of energy and end up chasing ghosts, doing shadow boxing.
I certainly agree with you. I'm just I'm very curious. I'm in a room. Mm-hmm. The CEO and his chief of staff, so to speak, are in there, and mm-hmm. one of them says, "Just a moment, let me reflect on that." Or language. I'm trying to make it as obvious as your cable car.
Yes.
How do you think what you've presented today, this context in the workplace, actually changes culture? Can it?
I think it can.
Okay.
One of the things that the researchers are actually pretty in agreement about is that you can teach, wisdom can be learned, but you can't force wisdom onto somebody. Wisdom has to, the person who wants to become wise has to want to become wise. You can't force teach somebody to go down this path. They have to want to do it. So I don't know where that leaves us, other than if we want to be wise, there are tools to do it.
What makes me wonder about is thinking about leaders who make conscious choices that they want their organizations to be different. The kinds of leaders who have actually had an aha about driving their organization to be more sustainable, whether the kinds of communication and acts of standing behind those values that filter down, whether part of that is sort of people responding to and observing people making more mindful choices, mm-hmm. and that then having an impact on the sort of state of the people they work with.
I think wisdom is like anything else in that because we're dealing with neural circuitry, practice improves performance. So you can teach yourself to be wise by practicing self-reflection. The more you practice it, the more you do the neural rewiring, the more successful you're going to be at it. So it doesn't take a great deal of time. All it takes is intent and some application. Having said that, it's a lot easier to say than it is to do.
Well, let's give Tony a big thank you, and I'm just delighted that you were with us here today, Tony. And for those of you who are out on the phone, if you want to be part of our chapter, again, we'd love to have you. So please stay in touch.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Take care, Tony.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.